Before we get started, just a quick word from World Extreme Medicine. If you work in pre-hospital, remote, expedition, humanitarian or high-risk environments, World Extreme Medicine exists for one reason: to help you deliver safe, effective care where resources are limited, decisions matter, and help is a long way off. From expedition and wilderness medicine to hostile environments, dive medicine, leadership, and human performance under pressure, World Extreme Medicine bring together clinicians and operators with real-world experience in some of the most challenging settings on the planet. Their courses, webinars, and global faculty are built around practical decision-making, not just theory, to focus really on what actually works when things go wrong, far from definitive care. To find out more and explore upcoming courses and indeed educational content, visit worldextrememedicine.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this session, we're going to be speaking about the power of narrative in pre-hospital care. So slightly different really today, but probably one of the most fundamental and important conversations I'm going to have this year. So we are deeply connected to stories within pre-hospital care. So whether it's patient stories or clinician-to-clinician stories, or indeed messroom chat, stories fill our everyday lives. So today my guest is Clare Murphy. She is a world-renowned storyteller who's been bringing the ancient art of story firmly into the modern world since 2006. So Clare has performed really across the globe, sharing stories with audiences as diverse as the All Blacks coaches, mission critical teams, scientists, school children, even the Irish President Mary Robinson. So her work also transcends entertainment, and she's taught the art of storytelling as a tool for connection, communication, and indeed meaning making. Working with communities, including asylum seekers, climate scientists, social entrepreneurs, firefighters, and limbless veterans. So her client list speaks volumes. She's worked with clients such as NASA, the All Blacks, Mission Critical Team Institute, the Drive Project, Social Entrepreneurs Ireland, and NHS England, amongst many more. So together in this conversation, what we're going to do is really unpack how stories shape the way we understand the world. Also how it can help us connect with our teams, patients, and ourselves in moments that matter the most. Clare, welcome to the podcast.
Owen, it's my pleasure to be here, but you can't be saying we're going to have the best conversation of the year when it hasn't even started yet.
This is true. Maybe it was maybe that was an aspiration, Clare. Maybe it was a positive vibe that might hopefully
I'll take
come to
it. I'll take it for December
pass.
1st. I'll take it. No, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm a very big fan of your community, and so I'm really honored to be asked because I see you at work in the world, all of you, and I think what you're doing is incredible.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. No, thank you so much. It's a privilege to have you on, actually, Clare. And I guess my first question really and framing question is why? Why is our story so important and to paramedics, but to the wider medical community?
So story is a type of ancient technology. We designed it. Our ancestors designed it. And it's fundamental because it's the quickest and easiest means for transferring and transmitting culture and knowledge. And that all sounds great as a phrase and as a sentence. But when you think about it, we have been speaking mouth to ear for at least, we think, about 100,000 years. So we have been using story, and it's really hard to prove this because, the evolutionary biologist might be saying, well, we can't tell if we were telling stories back then. But if you look at cave art and you draw the parallels, how old are these myths? We know in what is now called Australia, the stories there are at least 60,000 years old. So let's just go with 60,000. We've only been writing for 10,000 years and not even mass literacy. So this is our main form of communication, which means the brain wants to hear through the ear and speak through the mouth, this transference of knowledge. So it's all preset. We're not computers, we're not machines, we're not designed to take in reams and reams and reams of information. We're not designed to take in however many gigabytes of data. We're starting to think and speak about ourselves in machine language, and it's no good. Story has this way of wrapping around all the knowledge and the information, but landing it into the other person's memory bank. Because it's entertaining or shocking, because it's got visuals, because what happens in the brain of the listener is a cinema. And we've all had this experience. Forget about TV, forget about film. Think to radio when you're listening to someone, or think to your parents or whoever whoever you heard telling stories growing up. You start to see it in your mind's eye. And that inner cinema is more powerful than anything. And when you see it in your mind's eye, your brain attaches meaning to it. When you attach meaning to it, you remember it. When you remember it, you carry it with you. And when it comes to paramedics or medical, when it comes to really important stories, stories where a really powerful lesson was learned, or a really big failure happened, or someone coped with a grief, or discovered a new technique, or found the limitation of a technique in a high crisis situation, when you pass that on, then that up and coming paramedic doesn't have to go through that because they get to gain from your knowledge. So, I get very excited about the why. The downside is we see it as a waste of time because we're in such high pressured environments to produce outcomes that are effective, and especially in your world. And so sometimes, and I don't know if it's the case of paramedics, but sometimes we demote storytelling as something that needs to happen at the pub. You need to be funny to be able to do it. You need to be gregarious or extroverted. And it's only done as entertainment. And really, that's not what our ancestors were doing. They were ensuring our survival. So that's my why.
Yeah, it's powerful actually, because like you said, it was actually passage of information that would keep people alive, and actually, there's no more important information than that actually. And as I go on within my journey, within various roles and responsibilities, in front of many people, then in front of few people, I actually realize now, just to your point, you just made this point about how imagistic we are and how the creative imagination, if you can tap into that, it's powerful because every person transforms your information into an image, and you've got people in the room, you've got their attention and they're hooked, which is
Yeah.
which is powerful.
But some of your listeners are going to be sitting there and they're going to be thinking, I'm no good at storytelling. I can't remember a story. Mine isn't interesting enough, or some version of. There's a little myth inside everyone's heads, right? But like, as you just said, if you start with, okay, so I've landed on the side of a cliff, jumped out of the helicopter, and there's a guy there with two broken legs. I'm in. You don't have to be funny. You know what I mean? Like, I think your world of medical vastly underestimates how much we all want to know that stuff. And yeah, so just to say that to anyone who's worrying, storytelling is a skill. You can get better at it.
Let's look at that actually, Claire. Let's look at this skill because you have some core storytelling techniques to refine the skill. Could I just get you to maybe speak to and indeed unpack some of those skills or indeed attributes to refine storytelling?
Sure, but I might need your help if that's all right.
Sure.
So you were 20 years as a paramedic, right?
Yeah.
All right. I know you've had a lot of different things happen in 20 years, I would imagine. Can you think to a moment, one of the patients you dealt with that you're able to talk about,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
might have been in a very unusual location or difficult to get to, or so I see your eyes have lit up. Okay, tell me a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, well, I'll keep it safe because it's the patient
Of course.
confidentiality. But having said that, I've told his story on the podcast. I've got a number of stories of patients I've told on the podcast actually. And to your point, so I'll go through this story because it's powerful, and he shared it publicly, both on the podcast and within circles, publicly. So. It's a Sunday afternoon at 2:30 on May the 31st, 2009. Quite a warm day. We're up at the helipad in the Royal London, me and the doctor. The klaxon goes. It's a really loud sound. So it's an incident. So we climb in the helicopter, and it gets given as a 21-year-old. We get primitive information when in these calls. 21-year-old male, road traffic collision, RTC road traffic collision. It's motorcycle versus central reservation. So it's about a 10-minute flight to up to North London. Bit of turbulence on the way. It's a warm day. We land on a grassy knoll just to the east of the motorway. It's the A41 southbound. To what is a guy and a friend now, actually, who's been on the podcast, who I know is Dan Richards. Dan Richards is laying there. It's now about 2:45 in the afternoon, laying there in the sun, screaming in pain, fully awake, with almost complete right arm and shoulder amputation, having come off his Daytona Triumph bike at 60 miles an hour into the central reservation. His bike is 30 yards down the road. He is fully awake with one arm and shoulder removed. He's got neck flaps, so you can see his vessels, his great vessels. He has chest injuries, pelvic injuries, long bone injuries to his legs, bilateral fractured talus fractures, fractured forearms, in a real mess. And it wasn't what the paramedic said to me that was the handover, because he was screaming at that time, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die." When when we land, and honestly, in a real state, it was the facial expression from the paramedic. The guy, the paramedic just looked at me with the fear, with the fear, and looked at, so me and the doctor proceeded to the scene. He was very tricky, because if you got close to him, he tried to pull you in with his one arm, because he's just in a panic, in a state. And he's probably one of the most pre-hospitally most injured patients I've ever attended that's survived. Anyway, so we basically cannulate him, give him ketamine, so really powerful pain relief. We give him a huge dose, a sedative dose, which gets a semblance of calm to the scene. So he stops screaming, and actually, all of a sudden, the scene starts to become almost silent, which is great for us, because we can then orchestrate really functional, effective team working. We can delegate, we can task execute, we put pelvic splint on him, we cut his clothes, skin to scoop, we put a plan to do an RSI, rapid sequence induction, to put him to sleep and take over his breathing. I packaged him, and splintered his long bones and put him into the helicopter and flew him to the Royal London at that time. Um, we ultrasounded his chest just to make sure he didn't have any huge chest injuries. Um, at that time, he was moderately stable. Flew him 10 minutes to Royal London. I still, in the back of my mind, didn't know whether he was going to survive. It was a partial incomplete amputation of his right arm and shoulder. So we packaged it all together. Um, Fast forward 6 months, he comes and sees us up at the helipad. He had it complete. They completed his amputation. They stabilized him. They gave him blood. He had a wild ride of a rehabilitation. Nearly took his own life. Got medically discharged from the military. He was part of the King's Royal Horse Artillery at the time. Had a real roller coaster. Decided to flip the narrative, Claire. Decided to flip the narrative so powerfully. So on the 31st of May 2009 at 2:30 in the afternoon is when he had his injury. He decided he was going to not make that the worst day of his life, but the best day. He became a cyclist. He cycled for the Invictus Games in Sydney. He trialed to row the Atlantic. He learned to fly a plane. He dived. He met his wife in 2019, and in 2023, on May the 31st of 2023 at 2:30 in the afternoon, he flipped the narrative, and he married his wife. So the same day, same time, same month, same second of the worst day of his life became the best day of his life. And it's just such a powerful, powerful story.
I've got it in my body. It is immense. How many times do you think you've told that?
The Not many times, probably once or twice. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, you've got a really beautiful storytelling style. It's a very profound, very moving story. And I'm going to give you a technique now to play with it for a second. What I'd like you to do, because the structure is perfect. What I'd like you to do is go back and tell me that whole story again, but only in bullet points
Sure.
and
Sure.
in sequence
Yeah.
and as short as you can.
Sure. Okay, let's do it. May 2009, 31st, 2:30 in the afternoon, 21-year-old male, multi-system trauma, came off his bike, 60 miles an hour, real mess, packaged him up, flew him to the Royal London, had amazing recovery, real roller coaster, ended up doing the most amazing feats in this world. Married his wife same day, same time, and rewrote the narrative.
Brilliant. Okay, so I would add in a couple because there's some really significant moments in terms of the story of the paramedic, but you just did that in 7, which is amazing. And we'll come back to why this is helpful. But I would also say there's a couple of moments like when you see the paramedic's face and you see the fear. I think that's crucial. And I think the moment at which you reflect after you drop him off that you don't know if he's going to make it. So that would bring us up to 9. So what I do whenever I'm working on a story is the first time you tell it, it comes out as it comes, and it's big and it's full. The first time you tell it, you're telling it to yourself. And so what we heard today, just now, which was really powerful, was you've told it a couple of times. You've got feel for it. You've got it in your bones. But to all of those listening, don't judge yourself on the first time you tell it. The first time you tell it, you're remembering it. The second time you tell it, what I start to do is I get my participants when I'm working with them to boil it down. And I get them to tell it in shorter and shorter times to get you to what I call the bones of the story. Once you've determined what the bones are, which you just did, no problem, because in your brain, all of us have a storytelling editor. There's going to be people listening going, no, I waffle too much. I go on tangents. Of course you do. We all do. But you actually have a storytelling editor in there. So once you allow yourself time to tell the story, then reflect on it, then, okay, what would the bones be? Okay, we get the call. We go to the place on the road. We see the guy. We assess the injuries. We see the paramedic. We're not sure how it's going to go. We get everything that we can do done after giving him the ketamine for the pain. We get him back to London, And then once you determine the bones, when you go to retell it again, it should still be as long as the first time you told it or thereabouts. So whether it's a 3-minute or 4-minute story, but you won't get lost. Because what happens when we're telling stories, especially from our work, is it's really easy to get pulled into tangents and rabbit holes but once you've created a map, more or less, and there's no fixed formula for what that map is supposed to be. There's no single type of story. There's thousands of types of stories, especially in your world. But doing that little bit of work, I like to write out the bones. Some people would draw them out. I would not recommend you write out your stories word for word. I think that is turning a story into literature, and you need to keep it as oral. And then also remember, each time you tell it, it's different because the audience in front of you, the listeners in front of you are different. So sometimes you're going to go into great detail because you're talking to paramedics. But as you were talking to me, you adjusted your language. So you realize you were doing acronyms. I think this is because you're public facing a lot. You realize you're using acronyms and what I call subculture language. And so you would bounce out and you'd give me the explanation. And so the more you work with a story, the more when you reflect on an experience, it becomes a memory. When you reflect on a memory, it becomes a story. And by reflect, I mean then tell it. And then the more you tell it, you become aware of the knowledge that you've got in there, what you learned on that day, what he learned on that day. And then when you work with it a long time, it becomes wisdom. And so this ties into the making meaning stuff that I was doing with Mission Critical Team Institute. So some of your listeners are thinking, you only tell the story down the pub when it arises naturally in the moment. But actually, I tell the same story hundreds of times. And as long as it's alive for me, so as long as it still has worth for you, Owen, which it clearly does, because I can hear that in your voice, when you tell it, it'll carry that resonance, and it carries a ton of knowledge, that story. It's about rehab. It's about the nature of motorcycle accidents. It's about how you respond. It's about how fear can be transmitted across teams. There's so much meaning in that story. But until you tell it, you can't analyze anything until you've gone through the practice of telling it out loud, preferably to another person, which is where it gets tricky. Because some of your teams are working and they're not able, like you say, patient confidentiality, they're not able to talk about it. But if you anonymize the details, can you tell it to another person?
Yeah.
Because you will learn so much quicker than if you're telling alone in a room to your phone.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right as well to really to almost in a way record it and listen back to it because I th what I've found interesting, Claire, just being really honest with you, is actually listening back to the podcasts. We're up to almost 300 podcasts just on the Prehospital Care podcast, and I run a number of other sort of podcasts as well, but is actually listening back to myself because what I realized listening back is actually there's things that I would miss in the telling that I pick up in the listening. Little,
Deeply.
just, wordplay, mannerisms, or indeed words that just slip my consciousness. And actually, you only get when you listen back to yourself. It's bizarre, and it happens probably to all of us. There literally is words which do not register in my consciousness, which I say that
Yeah.
I only pick up in listening. And so listening back really is a nice read receipt for me to think, gosh, I really could probably shorten this there or do this or and there is what was it? There's a certain word I use like really. I use really a lot. I use a lot or
Oh,
uh,
these are the verbal tics. Yeah.
yeah, the verbal
Yeah.
tics, but also to your point around using accessible language, which are not three-letter, because we're famous within medical circles for using three-letter acronyms, and actually what that does is A, it doesn't let other people necessarily non-medical people into the language or indeed into the story, and B, what it does is there's a level of assumption there,
Yes.
which can even lose medical practitioners when it's to your point, subspecialist language within pre-hospital care. So it really is panning back and opening up the lens of understanding, and you can only really do that to your point by reflecting and
And
seeing
practicing.
where things land. Yeah.
And practicing. And not everyone's going to be comfortable recording. Like you work in podcasts, so you're used to listening to yourself. But some people are going to have allergic reaction to that. So I want the listeners to consider finding a buddy. Like I used my family when I got started in storytelling. I was like, right, I'm telling this to 5-year-olds. You're all five for a minute. And I used it like that. But in terms of subculture language, this is vital, right? Because subculture language is really useful. It's really important. It's a way of belonging. It's a badge of honor. And when you're on the ground as a paramedic, you can cover a lot of ground very quickly with another team member. The problem with, and you've said one of the problems with subcultural language, which is it's exclusionary, and you'll lose people even within the medical world. The the thing to keep in mind is that when it's your dominant language, so when you spend 8, 9 hours a day in your subculture language, it's your most comfortable language, right? So when you go to present or when you're stressed or you'll always default to the thing you use the most. And when it comes to raising funds for flying doctors or, getting society to think differently about medical and stop putting you on these invisible superhero pedestals that destroy you, we need public facing language, and you only get that through practice. So, to give you an example, I had the great privilege, which I'm such a sci-fi nerd, so to be at NASA was incredible, right? So I got to work with Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in Pasadena, but I asked them to choose some jargon terms that they all use every day that we would think of as normal language, really, but it is their jargon. So one of the words was mission, right? They use the word mission a lot. So I put them into groups. This is quite a common technique. And I got each group to try and write a CPE, clear, precise English definition of these words. We had 10 completely different definitions of the word mission. And that's with NASA. So it's not just medical, it's everybody. So the only way to get out of it is to practice all the other languages as often as you can. You can't analyze your way there.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's pivot slightly, Claire, and look at because one of the big elements of a clinician's life is listening to stories every day. So you listen to the patient story, the patient history, and it's t told through a story, through their story, either chronologically or not chronologically, actually, which can be a bit more challenging. But could I get you to speak to really how we listen to patient stories and maybe sort of reiterate their stories because we do that to build trust, rapport, and ultimately, to be able to get a grasp as to what their presentation is today. But we often condense stories, which is necessary because it might be a very long patient history. But could I get you to speak to how we maybe integrate patient stories in a better way? Because right now, what we do, we listen to the story, we put that down maybe in an electronic patient report form, which consolidates. I think one of the things we're looking to do in future is do voice to note, because actually what we want to be able to do is either get the initial patient narrative or my interpretation of the narrative, but I want the surgeon and maybe the rehab staff to hear my handover. That so that's not lost in time. And actually, probably even more powerfully, I want them to hear the patient story from the patient. So actually be able to capture that audio that audio clip in an electronic patient report form. So actually, it's A, enduring, B, it's the same story across the patient care network or chain, and C, if there is a clinician narrative, that's also accessible to two, three, four people removed from the handover nurse that you hand over to. So it's about capturing stories which last far longer than just the here and now. Anyways, that's what. Give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm curious because it sounds like the problem set is that something's getting lost through each transference. So when the patient
Absolutely.
says it, then the clinician writes it down.
Yeah.
There's only so much they can write, plus they have very long days.
Yeah.
So this going to voice note is going to be incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And
So,
I think one of the things that yeah, one of the things that gets lost in translation is just the factual information is important, but to to a fundamental underlying point, the tonality, the intonation, because I can tell if someone, and it might not be a priority to you, but if that person is in pain or discomfort or deeply worried, part of our role, whether people like it or not, is the psychological reassurance. It absolutely is, and the tonality of a patient story can tell you a lot about how worried they are, and actually accessing and mitigating that story through reassurance. It's simple reassurance. So actually, it is the story, but it's not the story at all. It's how it's told, the intonation, the tonality, the cadence, the rhythm, and actually understanding, reading the room. And look, if that's subacute, if it's not really, time critical, it's still maybe of fundamental importance because the way you're telling it. And actually, I still need to get down alongside you, have a bedside manner,
mm,
deconstruct your information so that you see it's important to me, and actually meet you, have an exchange, but read the room to what is beyond the story.
so what's not happening? What do you see as not happening?
Well, I think, to be honest, Claire, what happens and what doesn't happen. So, to your point, 10, 12-hour shifts, maybe 14-hour shifts, there's a lot of fatigue that sets in. And actually, there's a lot of maybe compassion fatigue, or indeed, yeah, compassion fatigue that can set in, especially night three or night four, or shift five or shift six. But it's still equally as important because that patient interaction is their sole interaction. Although you've had multiple patient interactions,
Yeah,
that 4 a.m. patient interaction on the fourth night shift is their first interaction, maybe not, but maybe they've had multiple, they've interacted with the healthcare system in multiple junctures. But nevertheless, it's getting behind the information and understanding what's important to them. And I think
yeah,
sometimes there is a degradation or maybe a disconnect by addressing the underlying issues, which might be deeply psychological as well as physical.
yeah.
And actually, Patients need both. They need psychological reassurance
Yeah,
fundamentally as a first, and then they need physical mitigation and offset. And
yeah.
that might be taking them to hospital, it might be something you do on scene. But actually, I see clinicians which address one but don't address the other, the psychological, that negate the biggest part of a patient consultation.
Okay, so there's a few things to consider in there. So one is tone is subjective, because if the language the person is speaking to you in is their second or third or fourth language, their tonal range is going to be completely different. Secondly, some people don't hear tone the same way. So I have a lot of friends who are autistic, and the way they register tone is completely different to the way I register tone. So I think you're right. I think a huge amount is being transmitted in the voice, face, body, but we have lots of cultural landscapes that we're navigating there. So if in doubt, ask would be the first thing. The second thing is, I think, you kind of said it offhandedly, but I think it's really important that we remember that at 4 a.m. on the fourth day, you're not going to be at your best. And it's not fair to expect you to be at your best. So you have to work with what you've got in front of you. So if you are heading into something that's intense, what are there any short-term things that you can do in the 7 seconds, 70 seconds, 260 seconds, whatever you've got before you walk into that room, that you can do to reset yourself, right? Um, be mindful of cumulative stress. So, one of the reasons for telling stories about your work is to relieve the pressure valve a little bit, because you can't go in fresh on day 4 at 4 a.m. And it's not humane of us to expect you to be able to do that. So, the kind of, I'm thinking of a friend of mine he's a surgeon, and he used to work in New York. And he got offered a job out in California. And so he took the job, he relocated to California, but he noticed really quickly that his stress levels were suddenly much bigger. The hospital wasn't more intense though. Like the New York hospital had been really intense. And it took him ages to figure out what it was. And the difference was, in New York, he took the subway. And in California, he drove in the car. And by taking the subway, him and the other doctors, there would always be a few of them that would finish a shift at the same time. They'd all walk to the subway together, and there was a pub right by the subway entrance. And they would always go in and have one pint. Now, in Ireland, that's a joke. You say we're going for one, it means you're going for six. But he actually meant it. But what happened was, they would have half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes. And over that point, they could get out the worst things that had happened that day in the safety of that environment. And then they get on the train. And he said it took him probably 6 months to figure out what had changed. So I get you. You all need to be listening more, and you need to be going in and hearing the whole patient story. But I have to advocate for the other side of it, which is, you all are human beings, and you have massive limits. And this is one of the things I want your listeners to think about, is I think the public narrative around what you do, I don't think we fully get what you do. I get, like, when an ambulance goes by, I can ask my husband this, I'm like trying to get out of the way as fast as possible. And it's a moment of reverence for me, because I know how you all are and how you work. And I watch people who don't get out of the way of an ambulance. I'm like, are you are you insane? Like, I've been in ambulances. Like, my first ambulance was when I was 12, and I have this very profound experience of my paramedics. So there's something there around the public narrative, but that's also tied to how much you all want to talk about your work. And I'm aware of patient confidentiality, but if we had any idea how tough it was, if we had any idea what we were asking of you, then we'd know that 4 a.m. on day 4 is really a hard place to be.
Yeah, no,
So we've got to
indeed,
mitigate
indeed.
it with that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I guess an adjoining question for that really would be, Claire, around how we, in a way, how we build a stronger storytelling culture, and how we build almost a culture where team members feel safe to share and reflect and indeed learn from others' stories.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is the big question, because you've just been doing a lot of work in the Red Cross. Like, what do your debriefs, hot washes, or AARs, what do they currently look like? Like the ones that you were involved in, say, in the last 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, they're quite factual. They're more cold debriefs, so they're quite sort of almost clinical in as such, removed from emotion. The hot debrief, I would say, would be a lot more emotive, a lot more visceral, a lot more connected to, yeah, to the emotion of a scene, and but I would say very much like you said, the humanitarian work involves a lot of cold debriefs, but doesn't necessarily capture all the hot debriefs, which I equally think are as powerful, sometimes even more powerful, just
Mhm.
as a bit of a release valve to be able to articulate how stressful a scene or a situation or a humanitarian climate was.
Yeah. So this is like the nature of your question is so important. So first thing is, what's physically possible? How much time or space is there in any given day? And often there isn't much. There are some formats that have been developed, the hot wash, the debrief, the cold debrief, the AAR, that's an after action review that the military use. And looking to the medical world, there's two that you've probably come across. The FMM, have you come across that? So the Finding Meaning in Medicine.
I have not come across that one actually, no.
Okay, so Dr. Rachel Remen, who was both a doctor and a patient, and she started to realize the complexity of being both. And she developed the Rishi organization, and she set up these meetings called Finding Meaning in Medicine. And what I would say they're akin to, but it sounds like a terrible parallel, is AA, something like AA. So they're anonymous, right? And you go in there and there might be a theme and you're allowed to, whatever you say is confidential, and you're allowed to talk about what happened in the room. But you're in there with other doctors and nurses and paramedics. So there's this feeling, there's this level that everybody has witnessed, difficult and terrible things. So the emphasis is on compassion and listening, not on advice. And then the other one is Schwartz rounds. Have you come across those?
Yeah, I have come across Schwartz rounds, yeah, absolutely, which
So
are
that's a,
powerful.
they're really powerful and they're structured. So those are two structures people can steal from. Having worked a bit with the NHS, I was stunned to find that there were no break rooms, and like they've taken all the break rooms out of the hospitals, which I think is such an inhumane act of insanity by any hospital. They'll have a room for a grieving family, but they don't have anywhere for our nurses and doctors to or paramedics to sit down and have a cup of tea. The break room is where it would naturally happen. So if those spaces have been eradicated in your workplace, we have to find a way to create the space back in. And the second thing we have to think about is, how do you set up the psychological safety that allows the stories to happen? If you go down the pub and there's alcohol, that's both a good and a bad thing, right? Because in the safety of the pub, no one's going to call you out on anything. But it also means the trauma is processed in a slightly different way. It can become a little bit of one-upmanship, who's seen the worst thing, yada, yada, yada. So the question really comes down to, what's the team capable of? If the team can, first of all, value storytelling, not as a wishy-washy, random, abstract thing, but as something that makes us far stronger than when we don't do it, because it allows us to process the residue of our experiences, allows us to make meaning out of what's happened. And there's a great paper from Dr. Preston Klein on this, which is on the Mission Critical Team Institute website. It's free and available to everybody. When you make meaning and you reflect, you gain that knowledge and wisdom, and you're better able to talk about things and you're less likely to completely burn out. So if the teams can accept that, they might be able to then say, well, this is our space for that. We're going to do this once a week. But given that you need the anonymity as well, I think each team has to establish a very strong culture code that says this is how this is going to go. Either we anonymize everything, or we're allowed to say whatever, but it doesn't leave this room. So it requires a little bit of thinking. But the other thing is ritual and practice. So if it's the first Tuesday of every month, it's the first Tuesday of every month. And there's a way to start it and a way to end it. And you bring ritual in, however that is. You design it yourselves, keep it with the culture of paramedics. But we are meaning making creatures, and we need ritual. We need a distinct threshold to cross over and then to come back. So you can't just, like, on the way to the helicopter be like, okay, tell me your hardest story this week. That's not going to work. But if you have a way to establish that space and time, and when there is no physical space, then get inventive with how you do it, right? So it's a little bit unfair because I feel like I'm putting impossible things into the space between us. But I think once you start to see the effect, so there's a great interview with Dan Dworkis, and he's interviewing. He has the Emergency Mind podcast, and he's interviewing this pilot, and she's talking about her engine failing in the middle of flying over. I'm going to get the city wrong, but somewhere out in in Asia, and her engine completely fails. And while she's going through her whole checklist, she remembers a story that she heard down the pub from one of the other pilots who, a couple of pints in, had said, you know what happened when my engine failed? I put it into this automatic mode and I had to hold it and drive it very slowly back, but it was the only thing. And that flashed to the top of her mind in the middle of an emergency, in the middle of a near-death situation. So it's so concrete what this stuff can do. It can actually save lives. And I think once you make that shift away from this is kind of entertaining, or it might make me a good leader or a good public speaker, and you realize that each one of you, Owen, you and everyone else I've met in medical, are walking archives of phenomenal knowledge. But because it's never contextualized, when you leave the medical profession or when you die, it all dies with you. And it's not about being egotistical or arrogant, but it is about saying these experiences have meaning. They have knowledge that's worth passing on. And as soon as you weight that with a real cultural value around legacy and around preventing burnout and decreasing suicide rates amongst the medical profession, which is quite significant because of the high levels of trauma, when you add that cultural weight to it, it gets easier to prioritize it and to make time for it, even if it's only once a month. But the knock-on effect, it takes time to see it. So it's slow. There's no immediate thing where you're like, and now it's done. But the knock-on effect is immense. So I'll end my long rant on this with a little story, which is when I worked for the NHS during the pandemic, I was only working for a small section, right? Because they're enormous. And they said, Claire, we give you access to the teams. They're all it's chaos, right? They're all completely burned out. It's like year 2 of the pandemic. You can have them for 90 minutes. I was like, okay, 90 minutes is not very long to teach storytelling, right? 12 people for 90 minutes. And it was online. So they're all calling in haggard, tired, hungry, ambulances running past house. You can imagine, of course. So we get going, but I get them to play this little exercise. And all it is it's called Talk for 1 minute. And you talk for 60 seconds about something you're passionate about, but it's not allowed to be work. So it can be a hobby, a place you've been, your kids, your favorite cheese. I don't care. Anything at all. And you get all sorts of things, right? So I go through all 12 people. They all talk. Someone's talking about cold water swimming, how that the only way she's been able to survive the pandemic is by jumping in freezing cold water every morning. Someone else starts talking about a VW van and how she's fixing up this VW van. I was like, oh, that's so nice. She's describing it. And then ends on, yeah, it's really good because I can sleep in it, which means I can park it in my dad's garden because I'm looking after him because he has Alzheimer's. And so we go through all 12 people. We get to the end of our 90-minute session so fast. And I do the little checkout as we're heading out. And one woman says, I've been on this team for 7 years. I learned more about them in that 20-minute exercise than I did in 7 years. And Owen, all they did was speak for 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? So like it just requires a tiny leap of faith. Make the space, make it psychologically safe, set up your parameters, but the knock-on effect for team cohesion, coherence, meaning making, loyalty, decreasing in suicidal ideation because you've got company, because you're no longer alone, and this is why storytelling is this immense superpower. And if you're not, this is something we used to say at Mission Critical, if you're not telling the stories of your organizations and medical, then someone else is, the
Yeah.
government, the public, and you all are doing tremendous things. So
No, that's powerful, Claire, and like you said, we all relate to each other through stories, but it's like you said, it's creating space. The psychological safety is a big thing actually to allow that safe space to share, and then the benefit that comes from that. Um, so one of the because so there is within a day within a critical care scheme like a helicopter emergency medical service or otherwise, there's multiple junctures of storytelling. There's the storytelling from the patient narrative if they're conscious and awake, or there's storytelling from the paramedic to the doctor paramedic team. Then there's storytelling which is the handover to the wider team. Then there's storytelling of the clinical governance, which is the cold debrief of maybe a case that happened last week, which is factored into that shift when they're not operational. This is all storytelling. And then there's stories which happen in the mess room as well. There's multiple junctures of storytelling throughout the course of a shift, day or night, and the passage of information. But could I, if I'm being honest, this podcast was born out of wanting to convert some of the lessons learned, and I never actually got there really, of trying to capture the clinical governance stories and the lessons learned from clinical governance in London's air ambulance, onto a podcast so that people could listen to it. And actually the information and the revelation and the wisdom could survive outside of the room because I realized there was so much living and dying in the room, and actually just capturing the audio, bringing it to a wider audience, just the received wisdom of some of the fantastic clinicians I used to work with. I get all that to say, Claire, how can we harness technology because we are living in a digital age, we're living, and the storytelling is happening online on social media. It's happening in lots of ways, and I love to tell stories on the podcast. I love to get patient narrative stories and clinician stories. We told one recently, from a patient and a clinician perspective. But how can we capture the digital age more so just practically? How do you capture it to harness the power of storytelling?
It's a difficult one in your line of work because of all of the mitigating circumstances. So, what I would say to all the people thinking about this is work with an artist. Okay, work with a filmmaker or a storyteller or a poet, somebody who's in that realm, because it's too much to try and get the doctor to do it. But we're operating in hyper siloed existences now, right? And it's just getting worse. So even within one sphere, one scientific sphere, one medical sphere, there's hyper silos. So people are so isolated from each other. So telling good stories, it's too much to demand of the clinician and the paramedic to be able to do this. But you get somebody, if you want to build a digital archive of these little stories, then you task an artist with that job, somebody who's really good at listening and capturing and editing, because then the work is not on you. It's their job to pay attention to it. And so I'm a huge fan of the idea of like having your storyteller in residence at your hospital or your poet in residence or whatever, because you would be amazed at how quickly they can figure something like that out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely, because absolutely we live each day through stories, and you're right how we capture those, but also how we tell them, and is it through checklists, but or otherwise, or but what's the deeper meaning, and how do we harness the deeper meaning from stories?
But that's for public facing. You're talking about not losing the archives of knowledge. And I think mm, we're so keen to get everything online. What I would, and I've done this with a few organizations, what I would encourage you to ask is, will it be looked at?
Mm,
Because we are inundated. There's so much online that maybe the thing is to build a fire in the woods. So like there's an organization over in the States where they're doing, police leaders in police, and they have this really intense and strong 7-week course. And it's the only time these people get to get a break from in their whole career to really deep dive into leadership. And we were chatting and they were like, Claire, we want to do storytelling. I'm like, good, that's excellent. Do that. And he's like, but how do we do it in a way where, they don't know they're doing it? And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, because it's kind of flaky and they're not going to want to do it. These are quite hard men and women. I was like, right. Well, first of all, they're too smart for you to trick them. So don't try. Um, have you got access to woods? He said, we do. I said, do you have a fire? He said, we do. I said, right, add food and drink and tell them you're doing a 2-hour storytelling in the woods and tell them why. Tell them the purpose of it. Because and it worked. It worked really well. They're now doing it with all their crews and they're making it a primary part of their course because of the outcomes. So while a digital archive might be interesting if it's done really well and it's short and accessible, like, have you come across the Nocturnists? Okay, so the Nocturnists, this was started by a doctor kind of following the same path as you, realized it was in the middle of the pandemic, and she realized that there was all these stories that weren't being captured. So she created a platform, and now there's live events. And she created an anonymous platform where people could phone in stories of things they'd seen. And that was hugely successful. So I think there are some on there. Then there's the Center for the Art of Medicine in Minneapolis. They're doing similar things where they're doing a storytelling night for their medical students. So before you ever become a clinician, you're in the practice of telling stories. But digital archives depends on how they're done,
Yeah.
and uh, you need to create buy-in and make sure you've got the hunger before you create the archive.
Yeah.
And that's why
Yeah.
you need a big fire and like roast up some
Yeah,
veg and
absolutely.
marshmallows, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the powerful things I've realized on the podcast is to get patient narrative. So actually, if absolutely, if they consent and they're happy to put it in the public domain, is to actually, and we did this recently, is get a paramedic and a patient, the patient telling the story, and then B, the paramedic's interpretation of the story. And it might not just be the paramedic. We had a surgeon on and
Right.
some a national advocate, but also, just telling multiple stories, starting with the patient narrative on the podcast. But that's powerful because you get the origin story, you get the clinical
Yeah.
interpretation, then you get the follow-up as well, and it really
Yeah.
helps piece things together. But it's very difficult with patient stories because, as you're saying, not everyone wants to tell them, and they're very deeply personal. But they are sometimes absolutely necessary for learning. Because where we learn the most is from patients. Claire, as
Yeah.
we pivot and just maybe coming to land, I'm mindful of time. Just one question, which is very left-brained, left hemispheric question. There is no one thing, there is no magic bullet, and there is no one key takeaway. This is way more messy than that. But I will say this, I will ask this, Claire, is around if there's habits or tools that you could advocate that paramedics or pre-hospital staff could use to yield the greatest return for team cohesion, for patient rapport, for learning, just tools or habits. Could you speak to some?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's no magic bullet. There's no single thing. But for me, ultimately it comes down to practice. So if it's really uncomfortable for it's going to be really uncomfortable for a lot of them to talk about this stuff. The more you do it, the better you're going to get. Get your reps in. So if it's possible, once a week, the end of the week, get your phone or get a person. Better if it's a person, and share one memory that's happened to you that week. And you have to say to yourself, I might never use this. This might not be for the public. I might never tell it again, because you won't know if a story is useful to you until you've made it, right? So you tell it out loud, or you have one person that you can call and do that 10-minute check-in at the start of the week. But it'll start to change the way you operate. It'll start to change your awareness, how you pay attention, what you're tracking in any given week, and then your database. So what I want you all to have in the back of your head, which is not where your long-term memory is, but it's where I think it is a repertoire of stories. I don't want you to have 2 or 3, because you have thousands, but until you do the process of telling it out loud, hearing it and telling it again. So get your reps in once a week, one story under 5 minutes. So it could be a 2-minute story. The more you do it, the more your memories are going to look for your attention. And then you'll realize there's a cascade of stories, and you won't know what they're for until the moment arises. So a young student comes in and suddenly you go, oh, this is that story that I need to share. But if you have 20 to choose from, you'll be in a stronger position.
Listen, that's powerful. That's powerful, and it's also absolutely key, like you said, to distillation and indeed to getting better at storytelling. So absolutely, Claire, listen, thank you. We're going to put your website in the show notes. It's claremurphy.org, and we'll put the links to that in the show notes because there's some fantastic resources on your website, and indeed you are available for consultation and indeed for teaching and training. So we'll certainly put that. I think it's absolutely key within the medical circles to be able to tell stories better because they happen at a rapid pace of frequency in it throughout the day or night or the clinical shift. So it's really important as to how we tell these. But listen, thank you so much, Claire, for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a million for having me.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.